I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am back with some recommendations for some science shit to read around the internet. So basically in this video, I'm going to be getting into just like a handful of science articles that I think are worth your time. If you do want more kind of frequent updates on like science things that I think are worth reading, I have a newsletter. It's at okidokiboki.substack.com. You can subscribe there. It's kind of basically like this channel. I just kind of ramble a little bit about some science things and pop culture things, but I've been including a section of like recent science things that I've been reading, just for, to get like some more recommendations out there. So if this is something you like and you want more of, you can subscribe to that newsletter. For this video, I've got 4 articles that I want to talk about. All of these articles I will link down below so you can check them out if they sound exciting to you. For our first article, let's talk about Monsanto. Monsanto has become sort of this quintessential evil scientist corporation. They are like their most popular is maybe not the right word, infamous, maybe their most notorious product is Ready Roundup. Their company is built around GMOs geared towards farming, so obviously that's kind of like a controversial subject to begin with, but on top of that, they've made a lot of questionable decisions around their technology, and they have a shady degree of influence that I think is part of like a big part of why there's a lot of suspicion around them in general. I'm going to like fully admit to both my biases and my ignorance here. I am a bioengineer by training. In particular, I worked in genetic engineering, so I am like generally pro the idea of genetically modified organisms and genetic engineering in general. However, my work was with engineering human cells for cancer therapy, not agriculture. So when it comes to discussing the role of genetic engineering in farming and food, I don't know really nearly as much, and I have a lot of ignorance in that arena. And that brings us to the first article I want to talk about today, which is I was lured into Monsanto's GMO Crusade. Here's what I learned. This article was written by Kavin Senapati and was published on Undark in June this year. In the article, Kavin talks about her experience as an advocate for GMOs, which kind of like naturally put her in a position where she was like allied with Monsanto, which, you know, as this GMO company is also pretty pro-GMO. Through that advocacy, she came into contact with Monsanto, and in particular with their then so-called Director of Millennial Engagement, Vance Crowe, and based on their similar priorities, they seem like natural allies. But as Kavin breaks down in the article, she kind of got to a point where she realized that she was increasingly uncomfortable with some of the choices they were making in their communication strategy. Like one instance that she highlights in particular was a fireside chat that they held with Jordan Peterson. And as she sort of assessed those questionable choices, she started to kind of like reassess the ways that they had like created a connection with her and maybe kind of like used her as a way to maybe broaden their platform in a way that she was also increasingly uncomfortable with. This article, when I read it, really struck me, in part because like of my own brief interaction with Monsanto. Like I said, I'm a bioengineer by training. My lab was part of a consortium of labs that work in this field, and so at one point we were visited by the Monsanto Director of Millennial Engagement, Vance Crowe. That meeting for me was really illuminating, and a lot of what Kavin says in her article about how like Monsanto kind of created this logic where to be pro-science, that must mean you're also pro-Monsanto. That wasn't in line with a lot of what I felt like they were doing in that meeting. I went into that meeting pretty neutral about Monsanto. Like I knew a lot of people had strong opinions, but like I said, I don't really know that much about farming and food, so I kind of just went into that meeting like wanting to learn about, you know, who they are and kind of to get a sense to like on how they were responding to a lot of the controversy. A lot of what struck me was the way that they used that meeting to kind of construct this narrative, like I said, like of like we're sort of like on the same side, like we're all pro science, we're all frustrated with the ways that people like kind of fearmonger around science, and in our case fearmonger around genetic engineering. And the way that that meeting kind of happened, it's like, oh, we're all frustrated with the same thing, well, we must be on the same side. And it was weird to me because it was like this conflation of like corporate food engineering with like grad student project. And like I'm very proud of my project. I think there's a lot of meaning to it, but like these are not the same things. And I just came out of that meeting with kind of like an icky feeling, but like not really quite knowing how to fully articulate what made me so uncomfortable about it. I just really like this article for being able to kind of like basically give a clear, solid framework to what Monsanto's communication strategy was and why it's such an issue, and like why it led them to create like these really weird choices downstream. I could go on and on about this, but I recommend just reading the article. It's a relatively short read, but I think very concise and to the point in a way that like still fully conveys what the Monsanto strategy was at the time. Let's move on to an article from Wired called "The Unseen Victims of the Opioid Crisis Are Starting to Rebel." This article was written by Michelle Cohen Merrill and published in May this year. The opioid crisis it's a lot. It's very complex, and it's a lot to examine about the pharmaceutical industry, about medicine, about addiction, about how we treat people who are dealing with addiction. And I think one of the things that's hard about it and that's complicated about it, but that maybe doesn't get seen as much in these conversations, is that there are people whose lives have benefited from opioids. And it's a really hard thing to address because opioids have been this huge destructive force. And so like it's something that we need to be more cautious about. It's something that doctors need to be more cautious about. But there's a question of like, well, like there are people who do need these. Like these are medications. There's something that have made people's lives like more livable. And how do we balance, this real challenge of people's whose lives were made better by opioids and people's whose lives were made drastically worse? This is a conversation I've kind of heard rumblings of from different corners of the internet, particularly from people who do have chronic pain and who have had a really hard time getting the medications they need because doctors are becoming more cautious in how they prescribe opioids. If I seem like I'm rambling or I'm kind of like equivocating, it's because I'm very new to kind of understanding like the opioid epidemic and kind of like how to like best talk about it. So like I apologize if I'm approaching this in any kind of way that's like insensitive, or if I'm saying something wrong, please let me know. But I wanted to highlight this article just because I really appreciate how it's able to give voice to the specific this one specific challenge of the opioid epidemic that I don't often hear as much about except from like the individuals who are experiencing it. I think it always helps to have an article kind of synthesize a bunch of different voices into like one overall message. And I think one of the things that this article did was kind of highlight like, if you're dealing with chronic pain, being able to do this kind of advocacy is like, it's even more challenging. So I think this article kind of like is really necessary for being able to bring light to those voices while like illustrating the complications of being able to address all of these issues at once. Okay, we're going to move on to the next article, and we're going to talk about the CRISPR babies. So if you're unfamiliar, CRISPR is a technology to basically let us edit the DNA of organisms. It's not the first technology, but the reason why it's garnered so much attention is because it's one of like the easiest and cheapest to use in a way. And it's really, really hard to understate how shocking it was last year when we all collectively learned around the goal that a scientist had decided to ignore the pretty standard wisdom that maybe we shouldn't really be editing the DNA of humans yet, and just decided like, hey, I'm gonna edit some embryos. CRISPR and like other DNA editing technologies, they have a lot of promise and people have been exploring them in so many different ways. There's a lot of really cool technologies out there. I'm going to be honest and admit that like I hate CRISPR, but only because I was a grad student when it came out. And so like when CRISPR happened, it was like everyone was like, shut up, we're going to edit the DNA of everything now except embryos, because again, everyone was just like, hey, obvious red line there. So there's still a lot of work that just needs to be done to ensure that these different ideas are safe to apply, and what are the ethics around applying them. Hojun Kai is a scientist who sort of just bulldozed through all of that. He came out of nowhere and was just like, hey, I'm going to use germline editing to create so-called HIV-proof babies. There were so many things wrong with this, from the questionable medical basis for his approach to the actual quality of his work to the pure fucking recklessness of it. But beyond that has just been this ongoing question of how he managed to do this. Like, science is rarely actually just some lone mad scientist in his underground lair. There are teams of people, there are collaborators, there are people who you run ideas by, and it's been hard to fathom the idea that this huge like of a project could have just come into being without anyone knowing. And that's what this article is about. The untold story of the circle of trust behind the world's first gene-edited babies was written by John Cohen and published in Science earlier this month. This article is a super in-depth look at the timeline of this project, as well as like who kind of came in, who kind of came out, who was like encouraging, who was discouraging along the way. And it's a long read, but I highly recommend it. If you're new to like this whole story, like you've never heard about CRISPR babies before, I would recommend this article because I think it's both like a good introduction, but like kind of a good overview. And if you are not new to it, I also think that this article is really worth reading because it gives a lot of detail. It kind of fills in a lot of gaps. For me, this article is really similar to my experience of reading Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. I had been super obsessed with the Theranos story before that book came out, and when that book came out, even though I knew so many details, I really appreciated it because it gave me so much more information. And I think this article is sort of like the equivalent of that. And that brings us to our last article. Last month, the Washington Post and the BBC reported on a research paper that came out claiming that smartphones are giving millennials horns. I am not going to be sharing that article. Instead, the article I'm going to be sharing is about why that paper is wrong. Clickbaity science is usually frustrating for pretty much everyone. Most scientists hate it because they want their work to be kind of assessed on the terms that it actually is built on. Most science writers hate it because they don't want their own reporting to be called into question. And most readers hate it because, you want to read about what's actually happening. And the problem of clickbaity science is magnified by the fact that like most readers of popular science articles might not have access to the original research, or they might not have like the background they need to fully parse it. So they're relying on scientists to be honest about their work, and they're relying on science writers to do their due diligence when they're reporting on it. In the case of this project, in the case of like this article about how we're all growing horns, the scientists actually did a very awesome thing though. They published their research in an open access journal, which means that anybody can access it. So Nsikan Akpan from PBS NewsHour posted a Twitter thread where he challenged people to find all the issues with the studies, and then he went one step further and basically wrote a whole article outlining these specific issues. And it's a great article. What the article is basically a step-by-step breakdown of what it means to kind of read a scientific article and how to sort of parse through what it's saying. Peer review is great. Like, it's a cornerstone of a lot of how science is done at the moment, but it's also not foolproof, especially when you take into account how things are translated beyond the original scientific paper. Peer reviewers on their own, they might let things slip, like things might get past them. And then when it gets reported out to the public, there might be things that get kind of translated incorrectly. If you're not used to reading scientific papers, you might not be entirely clear on what it is you should be looking out for, and that's why I love this article. Akpan goes through everything from like what the study is measuring to like how it's measuring it to like details that might seem like mundane or like they're just technicalities, but that actually have a huge impact on how you interpret the result. I think this article is really great kind of no matter where you are on the experience spectrum or like the knowledge spectrum. If you're new to science articles, or even if you have like zero plans to ever read one, I really recommend this article to get a sense for what scientists and like what science writers should be looking out for, because it'll just help you a lot in terms of like being able to parse critically what kind of details are relevant. If you are someone who reads a lot of science papers, I think this is also a good article to go through because it's always good to get a refresher to kind of remember what kind of things are worth reading and kind of like worth looking out for. There's a lot of details in scientific papers, and it can sometimes be overwhelming even if you're used to it. So yeah, I think it's a really great article. I think it's a great article for breaking down not just like a scientific concept, but just like the actual act of understanding and critically assessing science. So highly recommend this article along with everything else I've talked about today. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoy these articles. Let me know what you think about these articles. Again, this is something that I kind of want to get back to doing a little bit more regularly. So if there's a certain type of article that you're on the lookout for, if there's like a certain kind of topic that you've been wanting to learn more about, but just kind of don't know where to start in terms of like what kind of science writers or like what kind of outlet or something, let me know down below what sort of topics you'd love like for me to find more articles to cover, and I will make sure to get to them in future recent science reads. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. Bye.